The road to Serafina curved like a silver thread, weaving through deep green hills and ancient pine forests, where the autumn sunlight slid softly over the leaves as if time itself were slowing down. Elliot Carter hadn't checked his watch the entire journey, nor did he need to. He hadn't come to be on time or to arrive at any particular place. He just wanted to leave where he'd been. The backpack he carried wasn't heavy. A few neatly folded shirts, a notebook, 3 rolls of spare film, and an old Leica camera slung across his shoulder. The only thing he'd kept after the breakup 3 months ago. Not because it was technically valuable, but because it was the one thing she had never touched. Elliot had once been a war photojournalist, covering conflicts, disasters, those fragile moments when humans stood on the edge between life and loss. Those years had taught him how to see, not just with his eyes, but with something deeper. And yet, that very gift had drained him. He had captured too many images of people crying, unable to offer comfort. Too many children lost in rubble while he turned away, because your job is to document, not intervene. Until the woman he loved most told him, "You can't hold on to everything through a photo, Elliot." And then she left. Quietly, as if she had never been there at all. Since then, he wandered, taking pictures no one asked for. Half-open windows, park benches, a late-blooming flower on a crumbling step. He wasn't photographing for work anymore. He was trying to preserve something he couldn't quite name, but couldn't bear to lose, something he clung to in those silent frames. The first time he heard the name Serafina, it came from an old bus driver speaking broken English. Quiet place. No tourists, just forest and old people. That was enough for Elliot to get off at the next stop. He stepped off the bus in the afternoon, sunlight slanting over red-tiled roofs and whitewashed walls veiled in moss, soft as mist. The village had only one bakery, a faded cafe, and a small inn with 3 rooms. Elliot hadn't booked in advance. He simply nodded to the woman behind the counter, handed over his passport, and walked back outside, as if he had always belonged there. He didn't ask for directions, didn't search for landmarks. He just wore his camera and walked. The way he moved through the cobbled slopes, quietly observing chipped blue shutters and worn door frames, made it seem as though he wasn't hunting for a photograph, but waiting for one to find him. Goat-herding children tossing stones into the gorge. An old woman in a green knit shawl, resting her folded hands on a wooden chair. The wind brushing over laundry lines heavy with white shirts. Each moment was caught on film. But not for display. For safekeeping. For capturing life as it slipped through unnoticed seconds. That first evening in Serafina, Elliot didn't sleep right away. He opened the window, sat at the small wooden desk, and held a photograph he had just developed. A cat curled inside a basket of bread, sunlight falling directly over its eyes. Elliot stared at the picture for a long time, then set it down without a word. Inside, there remained a nameless emptiness. What he didn't know was that emptiness was making room for something that would change his life. Serafina had no gates, no welcome signs, no colorful stores like coastal towns. It felt more like a forgotten memory tucked within the forest, a place where time moved no faster than breath. By early morning, when Elliot opened his inn's door, the scent of fresh bread had already filled the air. He walked down the stone slope, sunlight weaving through olive branches, resting gently on children's hair. The stones underfoot were smooth, not from rain, but from years of footsteps. The white walls bore ancient moss like faded ink. Light blue shutters hung open or swayed faintly in the breeze, like the village was whispering its own dream. At a corner of the quiet square, an old man sat with a guitar, strumming a few tuneless notes. No one asked for a song. No one paid. He was simply there, an essential part of the scene. A shepherd boy passed by, clutching a small bamboo flute. He didn't look at Elliot, but Elliot couldn't take his eyes off the sun-bleached cloth tied around the boy's forehead. There was something in the faces here that made Elliot stop. Not because they welcomed him, but because they simply existed with quiet presence. No one asked where he came from. No one questioned why he spent his days photographing doors. Here, Elliot was nobody, and that, oddly, brought him peace. Even the light in Serafina was different. It didn't dazzle. It didn't demand. It spread like water, soaking through the cracks in the rooftops, resting gently on dew-covered eucalyptus leaves. Around 9 in the morning, when the mist had just lifted, sunlight would angle through the alley between 2 old houses, catching an old bicycle leaning against the wall. Its shadow curved across the stone, soft as a melody without words. Elliot raised his camera, not to capture a beautiful shot, but to preserve a moment that would vanish if he hesitated. Each time he pressed the shutter, he heard a soft echo inside. Not the click, but something more like a sigh. A quiet exhale of what had just slipped away. On a second-floor balcony, an old woman was hanging white clothes. The sleeves fluttered gently in the wind like lost souls trying to speak. Somewhere nearby, an old radio crackled out a melancholic Fado song, the singer's voice raspy, as if recorded in a distant past. Elliot paused to listen, then kept walking, his steps slow, leaving no sound behind. The road led him to the edge of the forest, where the village simply faded out without a fence. The pine trees stood tall and straight, like silent sentinels. There were no signs that said, "Do not enter." No human footprints, only the brittle crunch of dry leaves under his feet. He stopped. Not out of fear, but because something within him felt like he had just brushed against something older than time itself. In Serafina, nothing seemed designed to impress, only to endure. The quiet people, the faded houses, the birds gliding over tiled roofs without drawing a single glance. And Elliot, who had once roamed noisy cities, suddenly realized that it was this very stillness that made him want to stay one more day. He just didn't know yet that the most extraordinary part of Serafina hadn't revealed itself. The thing that would blur every image before it. Something no photograph could ever hold. Something only the heart could see. That morning, a low mist crawled along the ground, draping the village in a veil as soft as tea smoke. Elliot woke earlier than usual, not from dreams, but from a feeling he couldn't name, as if something was waiting for him out there. He stepped out with his camera across his shoulder, his sneakers dusted from days before. No plan, no destination, just a walk, to listen for the sounds left between the silences. The cobbled path curved behind the old church, where a collapsed wall opened into a low, wild field. Purple asters pushed through cracks in the rocks. A dry well sat forgotten, rimmed with moss. Elliot paused beside it, raised his camera to capture a butterfly perched on a mint leaf, and that's when he saw it. At first he thought it was a piece of bark, then a shadow. But as the morning light slanted down the hillside, he saw it clearly. A dog. It stood not far from him, thin enough that its ribs showed beneath the muddied black and tan coat. One front paw hovered slightly, as if injured, or long used to never bearing weight. Its legs trembled, not from fear, but exhaustion. Elliot froze. The dog did too. Only the eyes, those eyes, were not still. They looked at him, unblinking, unafraid, not wild, but not wagging either. There was no hopeful tail, no begging whimper, just a gaze that pierced through the fog, through time itself, reaching Elliot not with a bark, but with something unspoken and urgent. He had never seen eyes like that, Not in war zones, not in earthquake-stricken children, not in any living thing that had ever faced his lens. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't just, "Help me." It was, "Follow me." Elliot took one step forward. The dog didn't back away, but it didn't approach either. It turned, glanced once more, softly, then walked toward the forest's edge. Not fast, not fleeing. Each step fell like punctuation in the earth, deliberate, as if to ensure Elliot would keep pace. Not because it needed saving, but because it was showing him the way. Elliot watched, fingers still resting on the camera body. But he didn't press the shutter. No click, no flash. What stood before him didn't need recording. It was already etched into something deeper than film. He unhooked the strap, slung the camera behind his back, and followed. No questions, no certainty of where he was going. Only the quiet conviction that some things don't need explanation. Only faith. The first sound of Elliot's footstep on the layer of fallen leaves was faint, but to him it felt like a commitment, a point of no return. The dog walked ahead, not fast, not slow, as if it knew every tree root, every incline of the terrain. Its limp gave a slight tilt to each step, but the gait remained oddly steady. Elliot kept a respectful distance, afraid to break the fragile rhythm that now tethered him to the creature. There was no path, only twisted branches overhead and exposed oak roots veining the soft earth beneath. Each time he ducked beneath a low limb or steadied himself against a moss-covered trunk, he could still see it, the dog, still moving forward. It never looked back. But whenever Elliot slowed, it paused, just long enough to make sure he hadn't disappeared. Not a single bark. No wagging tail, just breath, steady, heavy, patient. The breath of something that had run far beyond its limits, like a mother who would keep running if it meant bringing back medicine for her child. Elliot felt his heart pounding, not from fatigue, but from something else. A feeling he hadn't known in years. The same feeling he had once felt on a field in Afghanistan, waiting for an extraction helicopter on a moonless night. A kind of silence so thick, every cell in his body had gone alert. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was instinct. Something was waiting at the end of this, and it wasn't meant for anyone else. It was meant for him. The Leica camera bumped lightly against his hip with each step, but he no longer noticed. His fingers lifted occasionally out of habit, then fell again. What lay before him, shafts of sunlight fractured by branches, pollen drifting like golden dust, wasn't meant to be captured. It was meant to be lived. The mother dog, and now Elliot understood she was no longer just a dog, veered right, where the ground dipped and softened, covered in moss and moisture. Her pace slowed. Her breathing grew harsher. Elliot quickened, afraid she might collapse before they arrived. The forest sounds began to change. Fewer birds, less wind, the rustling of distant branches faded. Only two sounds remained, his own footsteps and her uneven breath. Elliot suddenly realized he was holding his breath, not out of fear, but because he was close. That feeling pulsed through him like a heartbeat in his ears, a knock from inside his chest, something ancient, fragile, waiting just ahead. And Elliot somehow knew he couldn't turn back now. He took another few steps. Then the dog stopped. She stood at the edge of a hollowed clearing, surrounded by trees so thick they nearly blocked out the light. Elliot stepped closer, and only then did he see what she had led him to. A cabin, if it could still be called that. The roof sagged, riddled with holes. The walls were faded, peeling, gripped by a web of creeping vines that looked like they were holding the structure together out of pity. The door was no longer whole, just two leaning planks, one already collapsed into the overgrown grass. No signs of life. And yet Elliot walked forward. The smell reached him before he even touched the steps. Not sharp like rot, not the full stench of death, but something unnatural, a blend of damp, animal waste, and that iron-like coldness, the smell of blood long dried but not yet forgotten. He raised his hand to cover his nose, a reflex, but he didn't stop. His other hand touched the doorframe and pushed. The hinge groaned faintly. The door creaked open, just enough for the light to find its way in. Nothing in Elliot's life had prepared him for what he saw. In the farthest corner of the cabin, where only a few stray beams of sunlight reached, were 3 small bodies, curled together so tightly they looked like a single trembling shape. 3 puppies. Their fur was a patchwork of muddy brown and black, matted with blood and dirt. One lay completely still. Another wheezed, each breath a thin whistle like wind through a broken flute. The last one had its eyes open, but they were hollow, empty, so distant that Elliot wondered if it was seeing anything at all. His eyes caught something beside him, a rusted iron cage. Old, stained. The chain had snapped. Blood streaks were smeared across the rotting wooden floor beneath it. Scratch marks scored the timber wall, clear, desperate, as if something had tried to escape, as if it had been caged here for far too long. Elliot took a step back, not out of fear, but because his breath caught. The mother dog stepped inside behind him, not brushing him, not stopping, and walked straight to the puppies. No howling, no whimpering. She simply lowered her nose, gently touching each one, checking, waking, urging with a silent tenderness. The sight stopped Elliot cold. In the dim, tattered light of the shack, he saw something no one had ever taught him. A mother's love doesn't need learning. It simply is. It lived in the way a worn body still tried to give warmth to others, even as it unraveled from within. A breeze slipped through the cracks, carrying the faint sigh of the forest. Elliot blinked, stepping back to the doorway for air. Then he turned. She was still there. Skeletal, still. But the way she looked at her young had changed. No longer afraid, no longer asking, just waiting to be seen. And now someone had. Elliot stood in silence, hand resting lightly on the doorframe, his back touching the cold wood. He didn't have to weigh the decision. It was already made, not with logic, but with something older, something instinctive. A voice from the quiet places inside that still remembered what was right. He took off his khaki jacket and laid it down on the warped floorboards. As his knees touched the wood, he felt the chill rising through the fabric, damp, biting, like pressing into forgotten time. The first pup he lifted was light, heartbreakingly so, its body limp, bones fragile. Its heartbeat fluttered against Elliot's chest like a faint knock from far away. He wrapped it in his jacket, held it close to where his own heart thudded faster than usual, as if willing to lend it strength. The second, the one with the cloudy eyes, stirred faintly as he reached for it. A movement so small it barely counted as a response, and yet it was enough to bring tears to his eyes, not out of pity, but because hope was still there. The third lay still, colder, its eyes half closed, mouth slightly parted as if caught in the middle of a dream. Elliot placed a hand on its chest and waited long, then felt it, a whisper of life, thin, fragile, but real. When he leaned forward to cradle the last pup into his coat, there was a faint scratch behind him. He turned. The mother dog stood watching. No bark, no sound, just eyes. Elliot didn't motion, didn't call. He simply rose, 3 tiny bodies gathered in the fold of his jacket and stepped out of the cabin. And she followed. No hesitation. No backward glance. No command. No words. She followed. As if it was always meant to be. The sunlight outside made him squint. Golden beams filtered through the canopy, lighting the bundle in his coat, shaping it into something strange and sacred. Like a silent nest. He didn't look back at the shack. He didn't need to. The mother dog walked behind him, close enough that he could hear the soft scrape of her paws over damp moss. But she didn't press near. It was as if she was letting Elliot lead, yet ready to step in if ever he faltered. When they reached the forest's edge, his car was still there, parked beneath the bare-branched trees, casting a long, slanted shadow. He opened the passenger door, laid his sweater on the seat, and gently placed the 3 pups down. They didn't cry, didn't whimper. Just breathed, faint and slow. But alive. The mother stood nearby, watching. Elliot opened the backseat door, then stepped aside. She didn't hesitate, didn't sniff around, didn't pause. She leapt in, curled into the back, and lay down, her head turned toward the front, eyes on her young. As if she had done this before. As if this wasn't the first time she had left behind ruins to seek something better. Elliot slid into the driver's seat, hands trembling slightly as he turned the key. And for the first time in a very long time, he whispered to himself, barely audible over the hush of the forest outside. "We're going home." The glass door of the veterinary clinic swung open at the same time the small bell above the frame gave a dry, hurried chime. Elliot burst in, coat still wrapped tightly around 3 fragile lives, eyes scanning the empty room as if a single second's delay might cost him something he would never recover. Footsteps echoed from deeper inside. A woman in her 50s appeared behind a sliding door, hair tied into a neat bun, the collar of her white coat worn soft by time. She froze the moment she saw Elliot, and especially the bundle held close against his chest. "Please, help," Elliot gasped, throat dry. "They're still breathing." She asked no questions. Her movements had the rhythm of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and yet never numb to it. "Table 3, she said firmly. "Lay them down, gently." Elliot obeyed. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the coat. The room seemed to fall into complete silence when the 3 tiny forms emerged, curled, matted, eyes sealed shut. No sounds, no movement. "Lamp, syringes, fluid lines," she called toward the back. An assistant appeared with a medical kit, and suddenly the small clinic room transformed into a silent battlefield. Elliot stepped back, retreating into the corner, but his gaze never left the doctor's hands. A needle slid into the leg of the first pup. A small IV bag was hung on a stand. The assistant wiped away crusted dirt from their eyes and noses. Temperature, pupillary response, heartbeat. Every sign was checked. "The pulse is very faint," the doctor murmured, eyes fixed on a monitor. "If we can't stabilize within the first hour—" She didn't finish the sentence. But Elliot understood. The room settled into a rapid, wordless rhythm. Only the clicking of the ventilator, the whisper of cloth, the clink of steel tools. Elliot felt the world shrinking, down to just 3 fragile breaths, each one possibly their last. One pup twitched. "There it is," the doctor said. "Still responsive." Elliot moved forward but didn't dare get too close. He placed a hand on the cold metal edge of the table. His eyes didn't blink. "The second one's slightly better," the doctor said. "But the third—" She paused. Her hand rested gently on the smallest chest. "Is barely holding on. Almost no reflex." Elliot felt himself standing on a line, between reason and despair, his hands clenched, knuckles pale. He had seen people collapse in battlefields. He had photographed eyes going dim just seconds after an explosion. But never, not once, had he felt this helpless. Not like this. Not when the lives in front of him could each fit into the palm of his hand, trembling between what remained and what could be lost. He leaned his forehead against the wall, eyes closed, as if by keeping still, he could keep the whole world from breaking behind him. The heart monitor beeped, unsteady and sparse, not a steady beat of life, but the cruel reminder that sometimes survival was just a coin toss in the wind. "Low blood pressure, more heat," the doctor instructed. "Bring the heat lamp closer." Her voice was sharp but calm, the voice of someone who had seen more than a heart should bear, and yet chose to stay. Elliot opened his eyes, watching the rush of coordinated care around the table, and for a moment everything blurred, not from tears, but from a memory, a hospital room, a child, a choked voice on the phone. "You don't need to come. It's already over." 1 week before that call, Elliot had taken the last photo of a mother cradling her child in a refugee tent. He hadn't known it would be the last time he'd raise his camera for someone else's grief before facing his own. His nephew had died of sepsis. There had been no photo of that day. Only a message. Plain. Dry. From that moment on, Elliot stopped believing in things like just in time. So now, standing in this room, where 3 tiny lives, voiceless and unnamed, dangled between existence and oblivion, he could no longer remain on the sidelines. He wouldn't. He returned to the steel table, bent down, placed his hand gently on the cloth that wrapped the smallest pup, the one that didn't move, didn't cry, didn't open its eyes. His fingers touched the damp, paper-thin fur along its back. It trembled like soaked parchment. "Is it still breathing?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Slowly," the vet replied, eyes on the monitor. "But yes, we need 2 more hours of stability." 2 hours. An entire life had once come down to moments like that. Elliot knew this better than most. He sank into the chair beside the table, hands clasped tight. No camera, no lens, just presence, as if being there, fully and silently, might be enough to keep a heartbeat from slipping away. One of the pups let out a soft whimper, so faint it would vanish in any noisier world. But in this hush, it rang through Elliot like a bell. Not sharp, not piercing, but resonant, reaching somewhere deep and tender. He bowed his head and exhaled. His hand remained on the cloth, unmoving. In the pale glow of the heat lamp, old images flickered through his mind like frames from forgotten reels. A child grinning into his camera, a nap in a war-zone medical tent, a rushed embrace at an airport gate, a void where more should have been. And now, 3 lives with no names, 1 mother left behind. A journey without plan, a sleepless night with no promise of dawn. Elliot had never truly believed in second chances, but in this moment, with all that remained in his heart, he hoped. Just once. That it might be enough. Enough for these lives to continue. Enough for some mistake, even if not his own, to be undone. She had stayed in the room since they arrived, never moving close, never whining, never stepping between the lights and the hands fighting for her children. She sat, still as a forgotten silhouette in the corner of that sterile, medicine-scented room. The overhead neon lights carved angular shadows. She sat on the edge of that divide, not fully touched by the light, not fully swallowed by the dark. Like her, no longer just a stray, but not yet called by any name. Each time one of the pups whimpered, Elliot looked to her. She didn't move, but her ears flicked, Each time the vet shook her head, unable to find a reflex, Elliot looked again. She didn't lift her gaze. But her narrow shoulders tensed, as if her heart clenched with each pause. He knew that feeling. Sitting alone. No one speaking. No one promising. It'll be okay? Only fear. Quiet, persistent, cold as the floor beneath thin clothes. Elliot remained in his seat, back stiff, wrists numb. But he didn't leave. Not because someone told him to stay, but because something inside him whispered, if he stood now, someone might die. And then, something shifted. It wasn't clear when. Perhaps after the first sigh from the smallest pup. Perhaps when the doctor finally stopped repeating, "I'm not sure." Or maybe it was just the silence, stretched too long. Elliot felt a breath beside his leg. He looked down. She was there, slowly. Gaunt, head bowed, not looking at him. But the eyes, those same eyes, this time weren't guiding. They were simply asking for a place to rest. She stepped forward half a pace, paused. Then, almost imperceptibly, she laid her head on his thigh. Not pressing, not trembling, not seeking warmth, just resting, like the last leaf of autumn, not resisting, not holding on. Elliot held his breath. His hand hovered mid-air, unsure. It took several seconds before he dared to touch her gently, a tentative stroke across her bony forehead. Not to soothe, not to examine, but to say, "I see you, I truly see you." She didn't move. And for the first time since this journey began, Elliot allowed himself to close his eyes, just for a moment, and let the feeling rise to his throat. A head, resting without being called, without a leash, without permission, just resting. As if offering forgiveness, or perhaps as if saying she had already forgiven him, long before he even knew he needed to be. The night faded not with light, but with silence. The clinic room no longer echoed with ticking clocks, no background music, no hurried footsteps. Only one thing remained: time, heavy and slow. Elliot didn't know when he had dozed off. His head rested against the edge of the table, hand still placed on the cloth covering the smallest pup. The posture was awkward, aching, but he hadn't moved. Somewhere in his sleep his body had clung to the night, as if refusing to let that last thread of hope unravel. The vet had leaned back in her chair a while before sunrise, eyes closed for just a few stolen minutes. The IV bags still dripped steadily. The three pups lay nestled together beneath two white towels in the heated cradle, huddled so close they looked like a single form, fragile, pale, and clinging to life through something thinner than belief. Then, it happened. No dramatic sound, no applause, no collective gasp. Just a movement, so small it nearly went unnoticed, a tiny eyelid twitching. Once, then again, and then it opened. The outermost pup blinked, not fully, the corners of its eyes still clung together. But they opened, slowly, hesitantly, as if the world had just been spoken aloud in its memory for the first time. The first light of morning slipped through the clinic window and landed squarely on the edge of the exam table, right where those eyes met the day for the very first time. Elliot stirred. Not by his own will, but because something small had nudged his hand. A paw. Barely more than a tremble, like a leaf finally slipping free of the dew. He looked up. His eyes weren't yet ready for the light, but his heart had already leapt, one beat out of rhythm. The first pup had opened its eyes. Elliot turned to the others. One still breathed in shallow gasps. The other was silent, but no longer blue. Its nose had regained its sheen. Its belly rose and fell, light and rhythmic. He thought to call the vet, but another sound made him pause. Breathing, even, unstrained. From across the room, in the corner that morning light finally reached after hours of dimness. She lay there. The mother dog. Not curled in, not trembling, just lying still. Her body stretched out, eyes open but no longer watchful. Her ears no longer rigid, her breath calm, chest rising with a steady rhythm, as if, finally, she had allowed herself to release. Not to give up, but to release the fear. Elliot rose from his chair, stepped toward the warming cradle. He crouched down, eye level with the 3 lives the night had nearly taken. One had begun to move, barely, but enough to say life was no longer theoretical. And in that moment, for the first time in years, Elliot felt something he thought he'd lost. Peace. Not because everything was fine, but because this time, things were alive. The early light stretched across the tiled floor, over the metal table, and across the towel that wrapped 3 beings just rescued from the edge of vanishing. Elliot stayed there, no camera in hand, no words on his lips, just watching, as the signs of life began to rise like mist from the cradle. Each twitch, each flutter of a tail, each tiny exhale was a pulse that echoed backward, mending something inside his own chest. He reached out, gently, and placed his hand on the warm towel over the first pup, the one who had opened its eyes. And then, from behind, came a slow movement. No footsteps, no urgent breath, just a quiet figure moving toward him, her gait no longer limping like the night before, but still carrying the caution shaped by years of uncertainty. Elliot didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel her there. The mother dog stood beside him. Her bony frame hovered just inches from his own, close enough to share warmth, yet still holding the cautious distance of those who had once tasted betrayal. He didn't look up, didn't reach out. He let her decide. And then, she took a half-step forward. Not fast, but deliberate. Her head tilted slightly. Her nose touched the rolled cuff of his shirt sleeve. Warm breath met skin. Elliot felt something shift, a wordless exchange. She lowered her head and licked his hand. Once. Slowly. Then looked up. No wagging tail, no joyful movements, no leaning in for affection. Just one lick, as if she had measured, considered, chosen, and then acted. Elliot didn't move. But the spot she had touched began to warm. Not just from the moisture, but from what it meant. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't attachment. It was trust. Trust that he wouldn't harm, that she could draw near without being turned away, that this hand, the one that had held her pups, had trembled with fear for them, bore no scent of cages, no echo of locks, no shadow of the man who had once shut her away and walked off. Elliot finally turned and met her gaze. For the first time, he was the one who initiated. She didn't look away. Her eyes weren't bright or soft like those in animal adoption ads. They were dark, deep, still. A stillness that wasn't comforting, but was real. The kind that belongs only to souls that have touched death and kept walking. He placed his hand on the floor, didn't call her, didn't coax, just left it there. She watched and sat, close, not leaning on him, but close enough for him to hear her breath. That was enough. Neither of them needed more. That was all it took, for a morning that could have passed like any other to become the first morning of something new. The clinic slowly warmed as the sun crested the eastern hill. Light poured through the windows, dancing on white walls like golden fragments fallen from a quieter world. Elliot sat back in his chair, a warm cup of coffee between his hands, given to him by the vet not long after he had fully awakened. The smell of coffee mingled with cotton towels, antiseptic, and the soft skin scent of the tiny lives still curled asleep in the heated cradle. No one said much. No one needed to. A night like that didn't need to be discussed, only remembered. She, the mother, still lay near the cradle. Her head rested between her front paws, eyes half open, not asleep, but no longer alert. Her gaunt frame still carried old scars. But now it bore something else as well. Not fur, not skin, but a layer of stillness. Peace. Even if only temporary. Elliot unzipped his backpack. From the very bottom, beneath all his gear, he pulled out a small notebook. Gray cloth bound. The first few pages warped by rain from Istanbul. A few scattered lines in his own handwriting. Hesitant. Lost. He flipped to the first blank page, the first in months, and began to write. Day 1, a road not on any map, a gaze without sound, 3 faint heartbeats, now just a little stronger, and a creature, once too afraid to look into human eyes, licked my hand this morning. Not because she knew me, but because she trusted me. Maybe I should start trusting again. From here. He didn't write fast. But he didn't stop. Each sentence pulled from somewhere long buried, a place once crowded with words never said. When he finished, Elliot reached for his phone. Weak signal. But just enough. He took a photo. Not of the pups, not of her resting by the cradle, not even of himself, but of the towel covering the warming bed, creased, slightly scorched at one corner from the heat lamp, and in the center, 3 tiny bundles, curled as if the outside world had never existed. Elliot opened the personal page he hadn't touched in over a year. The profile photo was still a sun-drenched silhouette in an old desert, the last time he believed he could capture the truth. But now, he wasn't seeking truth. He simply wanted to share. He typed, I came to Serafina looking for peace. I didn't expect to find something greater, a gaze that led the way, 3 lives almost lost, and a gentle lick to the hand. She doesn't need to be photographed. She just needs to be trusted. He hit post. The screen blinked once. That was all. No expectations, no waiting. But in that moment, Elliot knew something. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't writing to preserve what couldn't be kept. He was writing to share what had survived. A fragment of trust. A story not large, but real. Elliot couldn't pinpoint the exact moment he made the decision. Maybe it was when the second pup whimpered softly in its sleep, curling up as if remembering a place it had never known. Maybe it was when the mother, still unnamed, lay silently beside the cradle, her eyes half closed, no longer flinching when footsteps passed nearby. Or maybe it was simply when Elliot realized he had stopped counting days. For years, he had moved as if fleeing something shapeless, a memory, a mistake, or just the raw ache of being left behind. Each flight had been a punctuation mark, each new town, a way to avoid staying too long. He had made no promises, planted no roots, everything was temporary. But after that sleepless night, something shifted. He no longer wanted to leave Serafina. He didn't want to get on the road just to keep going. He wanted to stay. The decision arrived quietly, like morning light spreading across old rooftops. No declaration, no plans. Only that the next day, he stopped by the small cafe where the vet often sat and asked about any houses left empty. The cafe owner, a thin man with graying stubble, wearing a faded shirt and chewing on a toothpick, nodded after a few thoughtful seconds. "There's one down the southern slope," he said. Old Carmela's place. She passed last winter. Daughter never came back. It's not much, but it's got a garden. Elliot didn't need more than that. That afternoon, he walked to the house. It was a small, single-story home. Whitewashed walls peeling with age, roof tiles uneven, windows cracked open as if still waiting for someone's return. The backyard had no fence, just a patch of overgrown earth dotted with wildflowers, and an old sapodilla tree leaning gently from one corner, its branches stretched wide like an arm inviting everything else to stay. Elliot stood at the threshold, hand on the worn latch. He didn't know why, but he felt he should knock, even though no one was inside. He opened the door. The scent of age rose. Wood, plaster, the lingering memory of a life that hadn't been spoken in a long time. He stepped in, didn't think about renting or buying, didn't think about paperwork or price. Just this feeling. If there was anywhere he could stop, even for a while, it was here. He turned back to the door and looked out. His old car still sat under the tree's shadow. She, the mother, was there. Sitting, not watching the house, not restless, but not turning away either. She was waiting, not for a signal, but for an answer, whether Elliot truly meant to stay. The wooden door creaked gently as the wind passed through, breathing its way into the empty space like the earth exhaling. Elliot stood at the doorway, watching the narrow trail where she sat. She didn't move, didn't whine, didn't come forward. Just watched, not into the house and not away from it either. And Elliot didn't call her, he didn't whistle, didn't stretch out a hand, didn't crouch the way dog owners often did to coax trust. Because from the moment they met, their relationship had never been about ownership or rescue. It was something else. Two beings, each bent out of shape by the old world, searching for a place where they didn't have to obey or explain. She looked at Elliot, so long that someone might think time itself had frozen in her gaze. But Elliot knew. Inside that stillness was a list of quiet tests. Would this place lock its doors? Would there be shouting after she stepped inside? Was the quiet here just a trap? He knew he couldn't answer with words. Only with space. Only by letting her choose. He stepped away from the door, walked inside, and lit a small lamp on the wooden table. No glances back, no coaxing. The house wasn't perfect. Chipped walls, cracked tiles, a fireplace that needed fixing. But it had soft light, open windows, and most importantly, no footsteps of control. No chains. Behind him, a soft scrape on the stone porch made Elliot hold his breath. No scratching at the door. Just one small sound, nails brushing against the wooden step. Then silence. He didn't turn around. Didn't dare. Because if this was a decision, it had to be made in silence. Moments passed. Then, a shadow moved into the lamplight. No urgency, no hesitation. She crossed the threshold. Didn't look back. Didn't scout for exits. For the first time, she walked into an enclosed space, not seeking escape, not lured by food, not pulled by promises, just because she wanted to. Elliot lifted his eyes and met that gaze once more. Only this time, it was different. No longer the look that once led him through the forest. No longer the silent plea inside an abandoned shack. But the gaze of a being who had chosen to stay. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. A decision like that, if spoken aloud, would have lost some of its sacred weight. She walked to the corner of the room, near where Elliot had laid out an old mattress. She sat. Then lay down. Not with her head raised, not with a heavy sigh, just curled into herself, as if her body had remembered how to rest. Elliot sank to the floor, his back against the wall, His expression softened. He didn't feel like he had just taken in a dog. He felt like he had just witnessed the most beautiful decision someone could make, after everything. A creature once locked in a cage, one who had lost all trust in enclosed spaces, had now stepped inside. On her own. It wasn't submission, it was acceptance. Inside the small house at the end of Serafina's southern slope, every sound seemed wrapped in cloth. Nothing in the room was remarkable, just a few worn items left behind by the former owner. A leaning bookshelf, a round pine table bleached by sunlight, and a threadbare brown rug frayed at all four corners. Elliot sat beside the fireplace, hands around a mug of mint tea, reheated over the iron stove. The fire cast dancing shadows along the walls, reflecting each small movement in the room as if the space itself was breathing with them, slow, deep, unhurried. On the rug in the center, she, the mother, lay on her side, eyes half closed, ears no longer stiff with alertness. The three puppies, after a long day tumbling through the garden, were now tucked into her belly like tiny rolls of bread, their bodies rising and falling with every soft breath. No one told them where to sleep. No one pointed. And yet the family, if that was the right word, was all there at the same time, in the same place, for no reason other than wanting to be. Elliot watched them as if he were viewing a still frame. Only this time, he didn't need to lift the camera, didn't need to preserve it. Because this image, for the first time, wasn't meant to be captured through glass. It lived inside something newly open within him. Once, nights for Elliot had been nothing more than layovers, a nap in a hotel room, a sleepless stretch under the glow of a laptop in some airport lounge. Rooms he'd forget the moment he left them. But tonight, the fire had been lit by hand. The window opened just enough to let the breeze in without stealing the warmth. And the breathing in the room wasn't from a vented air conditioner. It was real. One of the puppies stretched, legs twitching mid-dream. The mother didn't open her eyes, only reached out a paw and gently pulled the pup closer into her chest. A simple motion. But it caught in Elliot's throat, because it was instinct, because it was love, unlearned but never forgotten. Beside him, the tea had gone half cold, but he didn't drink it. He simply sat, hands cupped around the bottom of the mug, holding on to the last warmth of the day. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but it wasn't strong enough to stir the door. The house stood still, just like whatever had begun to root itself inside Elliot, something unnamed, but present. He glanced at the rug in the center of the room. It wasn't decor anymore. It had become a shared territory. No one claiming it, no one pushed out. It was a gathering point for everything Elliot had never really had, or had once and lost. A sense of belonging, with no conditions. The fire crackled softly, exhaling after a long day. Elliot leaned forward and tossed in a few small pieces of wood, just enough to keep the warmth until morning. He'd fix the hearth soon. But for tonight, this was enough. Around him, the breathing of 4 living beings filled the space. Not timed like a metronome, but real in a way that made everything else out there seem distant. For the first time, after years of wandering with no destination, Elliot Carter, a man who once carried his camera as an excuse not to stay, had found the one thing he couldn't photograph, a moment not to be preserved, because it was already alive, right here. Now, no one lives under the same roof without, at some point, thinking about calling the other by a name. But Elliot knew some things needed time before they could be named, especially when the one you're naming has lost too many times the right to be seen. He had considered names before, soft ones like Hope, Stella, Mira, but each one somehow didn't feel quiet enough. None of them patient enough. So for many days after moving into the little house, the mother dog remained unnamed. Not because Elliot didn't want to call her, but because he didn't want to call her wrong. To call her wrong would be to place something upon her she hadn't chosen. To name her too soon would be to shorten the slow return of something sacred. Elliot spent nights thinking, reading by the fire, while listening to the slow, growing breaths of the 3 puppies beside her. Each morning, as sunlight streamed through the wooden frame of the window, he would simply observe her, the way she used her body to shield her pups from the breeze, or gently brushed away stray bits of twig near their bed with a silent paw. Everything she did had purpose, and none of it was ever for herself. Once, he tried saying, "Hey, girl," while placing a bowl of water near the rug. She didn't react, didn't turn, but her eyes blinked, slowly, as if the sound brushed past her, received but not yet returned. Elliot understood. She didn't need a name to exist, but perhaps, somewhere deep inside a place still marked by chains and shouted commands, she was waiting for a different kind of sound, one not carrying orders, one not soaked in betrayal. Every time he crossed the doorway, Elliot gave her a quiet nod, like one does with a roommate. He didn't leash her, didn't tell her where to lie. He simply offered presence, close enough to comfort, far enough to not impose. And in that namelessness, something strange began to happen. She started watching him longer, began standing closer when the pups played near his feet, started choosing to lie in the corner of the room, where she could see him reading, but also still see the door was open. Elliot still hadn't chosen a name, because maybe she would choose it herself. With a glance, a pause, or perhaps by simply responding one day. Because naming, in this case, wasn't about finding a pretty word. It was about finding something light enough not to press on the wound, warm enough to soften memory. Something that could not be forced, only revealed when the moment was right. And so Elliot waited, because some bonds don't need announcement. They begin in silent presence, nameless, but never unseen. Nights in the valley of Serafina had a rhythm all their own. No streetlights, no engines, only the heartbeat of crickets echoing like the pulse of the earth, and the wind sighing past wooden shutters, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp. Elliot had grown used to that silence. It no longer unsettled him like those first nights, when sleep came late and the stillness made the world feel suspended in airless space. He slept on the sofa near the stove, close to the rug where the 4 of them curled up every night, one hand always near his notebook, a habit more than a need, as if anchoring what was slowly drifting inward, even if no words had yet come. Almost every night, she, the mother, never slept fully. Any time Elliot stirred, breathed louder, or brushed the table edge, he would hear it. The soft scrape of claws against wood. Light. Rhythmic. A gentle reminder, I'm still here. She didn't growl, didn't charge, just raised her head, ears up, body taut like a wire drawn tight across years of caution. Once, a pan clattered from the shelf. A stray cat had dashed across the roof in the dark. Elliot startled awake, heart pounding. He hadn't even gotten up before she was already there, standing between him and the kitchen door. No bared teeth, no wagging tail. But her stance didn't need translation. It was instinct, the reflex of something forged in a world where every sound meant danger, and also the reflex of a mother. No one had asked her to keep that role, but she kept it anyway. There were nights Elliot stayed awake, not out of worry, but because sometimes it felt wrong to be the one who slept first. He'd lie on his side, watching the fire die down, listening to the wind pressing against the far wall of the house, and knowing, somewhere in the dark, there was a pair of eyes quietly tracking every shift. He remembered other nights, long ago, when he used to sleep alone and still feel watched. The gaze of those who had turned their backs, those who had left emptiness behind without a word. But here, he was still being watched. Only now it was a gaze that guarded, not abandoned. No one had taught her that. No one required her to protect him. But every night, just as Elliot began to drift off, there would be the sound of soft paws turning gently on wooden floorboards. She never left her pups. But she always found a spot where her eyes could remain unobstructed. So if she needed to, it would take only a single step to place herself between two worlds, inside and out. It wasn't just vigilance. It was a vow, unspoken. Elliot never woke her. He never pretended not to know. Instead, he placed a small bowl of water near his bed every night, and sometimes would cough softly when shifting positions, just so she'd know he was all right. They didn't speak, but between them, a quiet pact had been sealed. One who had once had no one to protect, the other who had never been protected. Now together, they kept vigil beneath the same roof, ensuring one thing, that neither of them would be alone again. That night, the sky was clear. The moon rose high, a silver slice through still time, and washed the Serafina Valley in gentle light. Elliot couldn't sleep. He woke not from noise, not from dreams, but from something softer, as if the night itself had asked to be seen. He pulled on a sweater, poured a cup of warm water, and sat at the windowsill, where the wooden shutters were cracked just enough to let the moonlight spill into the room in a single delicate stripe. Outside, the cold air was crisp and clean. Even the insects had quieted, as if yielding to something greater, something quieter. And then he saw her, not curled up as usual, not lying close to her pups. She was standing in the middle of the yard, or more precisely still. A shape carved from shadow melted into the silhouette of the tree. Her back straight, head lifted, unmoving. The moonlight sliced through the branches and landed in her eyes, those same eyes that had once stopped Elliot in his tracks, eyes that had spoken more than words ever could when he had no words left to say. But tonight, she wasn't looking at Elliot, or the house, or anything on the ground. She was looking up, no blinking, no waiting. Just looking. Elliot held his breath. In that moment, he was no longer the man who had rescued her, no longer the owner of the house. He was simply someone standing behind a door, witnessing a soul in conversation with something humans can't touch. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was the part of her that had once gone numb during survival. Or maybe it was just the moon, the light that never speaks, but is always there. Elliot didn't call her in. He didn't want to break it. Something inside him whispered, "Don't interfere. Let her be herself, entirely, without the weight of pity." And then, quietly, she blinked. Not because of dust, not because of wind, but as if the moon had answered. She turned, walked back toward the door. No glance at Elliot. No hesitation. She simply passed by, slow, light as a falling leaf, and lay down beside her pups as if she had never left. But Elliot knew something had changed, because when she settled, she didn't face the door like she did every night. She faced inward. She faced him. And for the first time since they met, her eyes didn't just say, "I'm still alive." They whispered, "I've come home." The next morning, when Elliot poured water into the bowl and absent-mindedly said, "Luna," she looked up, not with surprise, not by instinct, but as if answering. A silent confirmation that the moonlight had left behind a name. Not for ownership, but as a way to remember. Sometimes, What leads us out of the dark is not a map, not a lantern, but a gaze that reflects the moon. Elliot always kept a clean towel in the basket by the door, reserved just for Luna. Every morning after the pups had tired themselves out in the garden, he would sit quietly on the wooden steps and wait for Luna to come closer. She didn't like being brushed. Not that she hated it, just wasn't used to it. But on mornings like that one, when the sun was still gentle and the breeze carried down from the olive grove behind the house, Luna would lie down before him, unmoving, not looking, simply breathing slow, and allow Elliot to sweep the fine dust from her thick coat, as if it were a shared ritual between two souls who had once been severed from all forms of touch. And it was on one such morning that Elliot discovered something that made his hand go still. A small scar, thin and precise, like a stitch, curved along the inside of Luna's neck, right where the soft fur usually concealed all signs. Another one, faint but raised, half-moon-shaped, sat on her front left leg. Elliot froze. He said nothing, just set the brush down and touched the skin around the scar, warm but taut. Luna didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She only sighed, as if she had always known this day would come. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. Some scars don't need explanation. They weren't from falling. They weren't the result of a scuffle or a careless sprint. They followed patterns, rounded, evenly shallow. They were the marks of chains left behind by time long enough for wire to etch memory into flesh. She had been bound, and not just once, not for hours, for weeks, for months, maybe for years. Elliot took the towel and gently wiped around her neck, as if tending to a memory that had never been his to carry. And at that moment, Luna tilted her head, slowly, and rested her chin on his knee. No whimper, no other movement. Just a silent bow. That evening, Elliot sat alone in the living room. The lights turned off. On the table was a print from his camera, a side profile of Luna, caught as she gazed towards the fields behind the house. The late light touched only one half of her face, just enough to reveal the faded scar like a soft cut drawn into canvas. He picked up a pencil and circled the scar, not to mark it, but to remind himself that pain remains even when the fur grows back, even when she sleeps peacefully by the fire each night. Some wounds don't bleed, but they never fade. The next morning, Elliot stepped onto the porch with that photo in hand, intending to fold it and tuck it into the back of his journal. But Luna, without a sound, was already standing nearby. She looked at the photo for just a second, then walked away. No glance back, no hesitation. And Elliot understood. She had lived with that scar far longer than he had known her. She didn't need him to erase it, only not to pretend it wasn't there. Sundays in Serafina drifted by like a midday dream, soft and slow. Locals spent the morning at the small hill market and the afternoon strolling through the Central Park, a humble stretch of grass with just a few old benches, 2 aging maple trees, and a rusted drinking fountain. Elliot hadn't planned to bring all 4 of them out that day, but the weather was strangely perfect, sunlight mild, the breeze like a gentle hand. The pups were older now, steady on their feet, and Luna was no longer afraid of the leash. They entered the park like any other family. A quiet man, 3 curious puppies, and a mother dog walking close, never leading, never lagging. Elliot found a sun-dappled corner beneath a maple tree and laid out the towel. The pups dove headfirst into piles of dry leaves, tumbling over bark and the scent of fresh grass. Luna didn't lie down. She stood beside them, ears up, eyes scanning every corner of the park, as if this too was a duty that still needed fulfilling. Elliot was just about to reach for his camera when he heard a voice, soft, unsure, almost like it didn't believe itself. My God, isn't that the dog from the abandoned camp? He looked up. A middle-aged woman stood a few meters away, a basket of oranges in her hand, her eyes locked on Luna. Luna stopped. She didn't growl, she didn't bark, but her body stiffened for a breath. Elliot saw it clearly, the slight drop of her shoulders, her ears not quite upright. A defense reflex. The woman stepped closer. That same look in her eyes, a mixture of surprise, sorrow, and memory. 4 months ago, I went mushroom hunting with my husband just at the edge of the woods. That's when I saw her, standing beside a rotted tent, so thin. She didn't move. I called out, but she only stared. Elliot said nothing. His hand rested lightly on Luna's neck, not to hold her back, but to let her know. I'm here. The woman glanced at the pups, then back at Luna. We thought she'd died. No one dared approach. That whole place was abandoned for ages. Some said people had trained dogs there, illegally. Elliot didn't ask. He didn't need to. Each of the woman's words placed another piece into a puzzle he had never spoken aloud. The scars, the silence, the wary stillness in Luna's eyes. He gave a small nod. The woman understood. She stepped back, then whispered as if offering an overdue apology. It's a miracle she's still alive, and that someone's walking beside her. Luna didn't watch her go. She turned instead to Elliot. And for the first time that afternoon, her tail gave a single soft wag, just once, enough to catch Elliot's breath. She knew, and so did he. The past, buried under layers of rotting soil, was beginning to surface, not through shouting, but through glances, and the memories of strangers. A seemingly casual sentence had opened something, not for Luna, but for Elliot, and unease began to take root. That afternoon, though the sunlight still spread gold across the path, Elliot felt something shift. He realized that peace could sometimes be as thin as a curtain, beautiful but easily drawn aside. He didn't tell anyone about the encounter in the park, but his mind wouldn't stop circling back to the moment Luna froze at the woman's voice. It wasn't the fear of an ordinary dog. It was the reaction of something that had once needed to prepare for the worst, whenever a human approached. That night, inside the small wooden house, Elliot didn't write in his journal. He just sat at the kitchen table, a mug of cold tea in his hands, eyes on Luna as she lay by her pups. She looked peaceful, or seemed to, but Elliot noticed. Her ears never fully relaxed. She was still listening. Always listening. And Elliot began to listen too, with his instincts. He checked the back door lock again, added an old wooden bar to the kitchen window. Not because Serafina was dangerous, but because the memories Luna carried didn't seem to end with that old camp. The next morning, Elliot took the pups on their usual early walk. But this time, Luna behaved differently. When they turned down the narrow path behind the church leading to the field, she stopped suddenly. Ears up, eyes fixed beyond the overgrown fence line. There was nothing there, not to human sight. But Luna growled, low and short, not threatening, just enough to raise the hairs on Elliot's arms. He tightened the leash gently, murmuring, "It's all right," even as his own gaze followed hers. No movement, no footsteps, but a presence, like someone had just retreated into silence. Elliot returned home earlier than usual. Something inside him had cracked. Not much, but enough. He had lived long enough in London to know the difference between ordinary unease and the sense of danger. And what worried him most was that the feeling didn't come from his imagination. It came from Luna, a creature who had learned to survive by instinct, and now sensed something he could not see. That night, Elliot set his camera on the windowsill, switched it to silent record mode. Not for any particular reason, just in case there was something the human eye might miss. He didn't sleep deeply. His dreams were layered, nameless, fragmented images, glances, clinking metal chains, and a bark being choked off. And when he woke before dawn, moonlight cutting across the wooden floor, Luna was still awake, her eyes open, watching the door. She hadn't moved. But Elliot realized the most alarming thing wasn't movement. It was when a creature that had once been broken learned not to move in order to hear what others didn't. And he knew. The storm hadn't come. But the sky was already changing color. The late afternoon sun had painted the treetops in the park with a gentle, golden hue. Elliot sat quietly on a weathered bench by the old wooden fence, his camera slung loosely around his neck, eyes following the 3 puppies tumbling in the grass nearby. Their mother, still unnamed, sat behind them, tucked in the shade where the earth stayed cool. Her ears were alert, tall and rigid, her gaze fixed on her children, unwavering. That day, Serafina felt perfect. The breeze was soft. Children giggled near the fountain. Elderly couples read slowly beneath the flowering vines. Elliot felt almost certain that everything was beginning to heal, as if the wounds had been stitched and might truly close. Until he heard heavy footsteps crunching through the gravel behind him. He turned and saw 2 men approaching. One was tall, hair long and greasy, his torn leather jacket flapping with each stride. The other was shorter, stockier, with dirt-caked jeans and both hands buried in his pockets. They didn't look at anyone else, only at the dog sitting beside Elliot. And as Elliot stood up, the taller one spoke, "She belongs to us." Elliot furrowed his brow. "I'm not sure I understand what you're saying." The shorter man smirked, his voice low and coarse. "You pick her up off the street or something? She's not a stray. She's ours. We raised her. You've got no right to keep her." The air around Elliot changed instantly. The mother dog stood, but didn't move forward. She simply came to Elliot's side, her body tense, head lowered, like a shadow folding in on itself, preparing. Elliot slowly lowered his hand, not to touch her, just to send something unseen. A presence. A message. "You're not alone." He looked at the 2 men, voice calm but firm. "I took her and her pups to the vet. They were starving, injured, left in a collapsed tent behind the woods. No one was there. No name, no chip. Do you have any paperwork?" The tall one stepped closer, voice tightening. "Who do you think you are to ask that?" His eyes flicked toward the 3 pups now huddling behind their mother's legs. "I see 'em, all her brats. Damn bitch ran off before they were even weaned." Elliot's fists clenched, but before he could speak, the other man cut in. This time, colder. "Listen, you hand her over now, or I'm calling the cops. Theft of property. Don't think being a tourist gives you any special rights." A breeze whispered through the branches above. Elliot realized his hands were starting to tremble, not from fear, but from fury. And yet, what made his chest tighten was how the mother dog didn't run. She stood her ground. No whine, no retreat. Just waiting. A thin line had drawn itself in the dirt, between humanity and something more primal. No one in the park noticed the standoff unfolding by the north fence. Not until the sound came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed. A growl, deep, resonant, rising from the bottom of her throat like something older than fear itself. She had stepped forward. Her gait still bore the limp of days spent crossing forests and silence. But her posture rose higher than ever before. Not broken, but dignified. Her dark coat caught the light, glinting like burnished armor beneath the setting sun, and her eyes, those same eyes that once held a forest full of sorrow, no longer trembled. They blazed. The tall man paused mid-step. "Hey, what's she doing? You gonna bite, huh?" She didn't answer. Of course not. She simply growled again, longer this time, a sound that pulled the entire park into sudden stillness. The puppies, who had taken shelter beneath the bench, now peeked out. Their wide eyes locked onto their mother. No yelping, no whimpering. They recognized it too. Something sacred, something solemn, something far older than any command. A child suddenly burst into tears. Her mother quickly picked her up and turned away, but froze mid-step when she saw what was unfolding just ahead. An elderly woman pushing a shopping cart stopped, shading her eyes to see more clearly. A young man jogging along the path slowed down, then came to a complete halt. Elliot said nothing. There was nothing left to say, because in that moment the dog he once rescued, or perhaps the one who rescued him, stood before him like a wall, not asking for protection, but becoming it. The shorter man stepped back half a pace. "Damn mutt!" The taller one grabbed his arm, whispering something under his breath. Then they both glanced around, and realized at least 5 people were watching them now. A woman was holding up her phone, recording silently. The mother dog didn't bark. She didn't need to. She took one more step, placing herself fully between Elliot and the threat. No one translated the sound of her growl, but everyone understood it. "I am a mother, and these are my children. If you take one more step, I will give everything, not out of instinct, not by command, but because of love. A love without language, without ownership, only choice. And it was a choice that could never be forced." A voice rang out from behind the gathering crowd, soft but resolute. "I've called the police. They're on their way." The 2 men froze. The crowd parted like water splitting around a stone, to reveal the woman Elliot had met just days ago. Her gaze was steady, kind yet firm, like someone who had seen moments like this before. "She was left in that abandoned camp," the woman said calmly. "I was the first to find her. They kept her in a cage, no food, no water. I reported it. But by the time the officers arrived, they'd vanished, and now they've come back thinking no one would remember." A hush followed. Only the soft rustle of wind through the trees remained, and the steady breath of the mother dog, no longer growling, but still standing tall, her eyes locked onto the 2 men. A police car pulled up at the edge of the park. 2 officers stepped out. One approached, asked a few brief questions. The woman spoke clearly. Elliot didn't need to say anything. Luna's eyes spoke for them both. The scar on her leg, the way she stood, a creature who had known chains too long, and above all, the unwavering way she shielded her children. It was evidence no one could deny. One officer turned to the men. "You are under investigation for animal abuse and abandonment under Section 276, Article 3. Please come with us." "What? I just forgot about her, that's all," the taller man sputtered, voice climbing. "A month without food, water, or care, chained in a collapsing shack," the officer replied. "That's not forgetting. That's abuse, and it has consequences." The men were handcuffed. The shorter one started to turn his head, but froze as Luna's gaze met his. Not because he feared being bitten, but because he understood. He had lost something that no amount of words could ever retrieve. Trust. The patrol car drove off, engines fading into the distance, leaving behind a strange kind of silence, as if no one could quite believe what they had just witnessed. Elliot remained where he stood, unmoving. And Luna, after a moment of watching the car disappear, finally turned back. She walked slowly, deliberately, until she stood by his side again. Then, as if none of it had ever happened, she sat down. Not leaning in, not begging, not asking to be touched. She was simply there, and when Elliot knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on her head, he realized something in her eyes had changed. It was no longer a plea, no longer just gratitude. It was something larger, a vow, one that needed no words, no witness. He had stayed when she needed him most. Now it was her turn. The fire crackled softly in the small stove at the center of the old brick house. Amber light flickered against the rough walls, casting Elliot's shadow twice his size, as if the loneliness he carried still hadn't burned off, even with 4 new lives now moving gently around him. Beneath his feet, a thin, hand-woven rug from the village market had begun to fray at the edges. The puppies lay tangled atop one another, curled like tufts of gray-brown yarn, occasionally shifting with each pop from the burning logs. And in a far corner, as always, she sat, quiet, alert, not nestled among her pups, not resting near Elliot. She simply sat, ears perked at every creak from the porch or whistle of wind against the window frame. A sentinel who never clocked out, even after the world had once abandoned her. Elliot held a steaming cup of mint tea in both hands, drawing its warmth into his palms. Serafina was tipping into late winter, not cold enough to bite, but just sharp enough to make anyone who had once lost warmth feel the brittle edge of that absence. He exhaled slowly and set the cup down on the wooden table. Faint scratches still marked his wrist, remnants of that first night at the clinic, when he'd clutched the smallest puppy and prayed like a boy afraid to lose his mother. Since coming to Serafina, he'd lived more than he ever had in the years he thought he was surviving. She was still there, watching him, but never reaching out. And Elliot understood. He didn't call her, didn't pat his thigh. He simply sat, the way he had on those first evenings in the forest, watching a creature in pain still rise to lead the way toward what was right. And then she stood. No sound, no growl, no glance toward the door. Just a slow, deliberate rise, as if even she were surprised by her own decision. Elliot straightened slightly, thinking she might be heading outside. But she wasn't. She walked toward him. Step by step, each one as light as if afraid to disturb the fragile air that now wrapped around them. Elliot didn't move. His heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from a deep awareness that something rare was unfolding, and the wrong move might make it vanish. She stopped beside his leg, didn't lick, didn't nuzzle, didn't perform. She simply looked up at him and held his gaze for a long time. Then, as gentle as a leaf touching still water, she rested her head on his leg. Elliot forgot to breathe. He didn't reach for her right away. He only looked down, to the place where her breath now warmed the fabric of his pants. This wasn't survival, not a plea, not submission. It was a choice. A creature once betrayed, once abandoned, once forced to stand guard through the dark and the memories, had now placed the softest, most vulnerable part of herself on a stranger. And Elliot understood. In that moment, he was no longer a stranger. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, the room sank into a silence as soft as a wool blanket. Elliot remained still, even as his legs began to numb. He didn't care. He feared that any shift, any sound, might undo the decision she'd made. The first decision since the day they met. Her head remained on his leg, weighted with a gentle trust. Her breath rose and fell against the rough fabric, carrying the scent of earth and forest, and perhaps stories never told aloud. Elliot slowly lowered his hand, touched the fur that had softened in the days since she'd been cared for. She didn't flinch. It was the first sign of permission. No recoil, no stiffness, just presence. He smiled gently, and for the first time since setting foot in Serafina, he whispered a name in his heart. Luna. A simple word. But when it surfaced, it carried the resonance of something he'd been missing for far too long. A presence that asked for nothing and meant everything. He hadn't expected to find a name that fit so perfectly. But when he looked back at that first image, that morning in the sparse woods, light piercing through leaves, her eyes watching him from the shadows, he knew there could be no other name. Luna. The moon. Not for her color, not for her shape, but for the way she appeared. Quiet, without fanfare, without wagging, just watching. As if to say, I know you're lost too. And truthfully, Elliot had been lost. Not just in the woods, but in his life. A life filled with losses that were never mourned aloud, fractures that had no name, and memories that lived only as faded images on a camera screen. But Luna didn't need to understand any of that. She only needed to be there. Elliot glanced toward the window. The moon had risen, high, pale, and round, like a thin layer of ice floating across the night sky of Serafina. Its light filtered through the glass, casting soft glows on the floor where 3 tiny pups slept undisturbed. A silent benediction from above, bestowed upon the forgotten. Luna, he whispered, saying it out loud for the first time. Her ears twitched. She didn't lift her head. But he saw it, a faint movement in her tail, a flick, so slight it might have gone unnoticed. But to Elliot, it was unmistakable. She had heard, and she did not object. Luna. A name. A beginning. No paperwork, no ID tags or microchips, just a single word, heavy with everything that had never been spoken. In the hush of the little wooden house, where even the smallest sounds carried, the pop of firewood, the slow breathing of pups curled under the table, Elliot didn't need light to know what had just occurred. He only needed feeling, a movement, subtle, but so clear it softened his entire chest. She, Luna, had wagged her tail, not in excitement, not in innocence, not out of instinct like other dogs who greet joy with motion. This wag was different. It was a signal, sent from the deepest part of a soul once torn, stitched now by threads as fragile as the word safe. Elliot said nothing. He only watched. Close enough to witness it clearly, but far enough not to disturb what was just beginning to form. Luna's eyes remained closed. Her head still rested on his leg. Still. Unmoving. Calm. Only her tail, like a single needle rising through still water, shifted once, then stopped. And in that stillness, Elliot understood something no language could ever express. I've lost more than you know, but I am staying. He didn't know the full story behind her, the scars on her neck, the slight limp in her step, the way she shielded her pups from everything but air. But he knew this. Any creature, man or dog, who has been betrayed to the root of their instinct, for them to wag a tail again, that is no small thing. His throat tightened, not out of simple emotion, but from something deeper, from knowing within his soul that this was not just a dog's acceptance. It was forgiveness, forgiveness for the world, forgiveness for humankind, and maybe, just maybe, a first light she allowed herself to carry again. A breeze slipped through the door crack. Moonlight painted patterns on the wooden floor like scattered silver flakes. And in that tender darkness, time seemed to stop, as if the universe had carved out space for a moment only they could touch. Perhaps. This is how family begins. Not with words, not with signatures, but with a wag of the tail. A small gesture, carrying the weight of an entire destiny. And from that night on, Elliot never thought of Luna as a stray mother. She had chosen her name. She had chosen whom to trust. And with a single silent wag of her tail, she had spoken more clearly than any language could. I'm here now. I'm not running anymore. Mornings in Serafina had changed since that day. They were no longer lonely footsteps on old stone paths, no longer the sound of a door creaking open just to let the wind fill an empty house. Now, Elliot woke to a different kind of sound, the rustling of three little creatures battling over an old wool slipper, the soft scratching of paws on wood, and sometimes faint, dreamy murmurs from the corner of the room, where Luna curled up, no longer on high alert. She still slept by the door, but not to guard against the world. This time, it was to rest assured that if needed, she could rise and protect what she now loved, without having to fight everything outside it. Elliot learned to be a father without a plan. He cut old towels into blankets, carved food bowls from wood, even built a cardboard and pillow fortress for the pups to tumble in. And Luna, at first only watching from afar, gradually took a step closer. The first time she lay near them, head turned the other way. The second, she lay beside them, eyes open, ears alert. And one morning, Elliot walked out from the kitchen and froze at what he saw. Luna was sleeping on her back, belly exposed to the ceiling, a position that only comes when fear is no longer present. It wasn't submission. It was victory, for a soul who once survived on raw instinct and was now relearning how to simply breathe in peace. Elliot began to notice the small shifts. She reacted to squeaky toys. She didn't bolt at the clang of a pan or the roar of passing motorbikes. Occasionally, he caught her watching the little ones dash around, and in her gaze, he saw something that resembled a smile. One evening, as the sun cast a golden glaze across the roof, Elliot tossed a soft ball across the yard. Not with expectation, just a quiet trial. At first, Luna didn't move, but when one of her pups dashed after it, she followed, not to snatch it away, but to run, to play, her gait still uneven, but this run was no longer a flight. It was participation. Elliot stood there, camera in hand, but didn't press the shutter. Because some moments aren't meant to be captured. They're meant to be felt. With each passing day, the house no longer felt temporary. It became a home. The bricks, the chipped bowls, the stains on throw pillows, each became part of something larger. A family, rebuilding itself through the smallest things. Luna never needed to be taught how to love. She only needed time to believe that love wasn't dangerous. And in those sun-soaked days, with small footsteps circling the yard and steady breaths rising and falling at nightfall, Elliot knew. They were no longer alone. One morning, before sunlight reached the grapevines behind the house, Elliot sat at the little wooden table. His old laptop hummed quietly before him. The scent of coffee mingled with the damp fur of three freshly bathed pups. And at his feet, Luna lay half asleep, her ears twitching faintly with the rhythm of his typing. He hadn't planned to write anything. It started with a few photographs, light spilling through a window onto Luna's frail body as she cradled her pups. Another, the three of them tugging at a wool sock, tumbling into her belly. Another still, a fire crackling, Elliot adjusting a new collar, Luna watching from behind, not avoiding the gaze, but holding it. The photos weren't edited, no fancy lenses, but there was something in her eyes, the tilt of her head, or just the way her shadow stretched across the porch, that made people pause. Elliot titled the piece. I meant to travel. But one gaze led me into the woods. He told the whole story, how an ordinary morning in Serafina became fate, the paw prints that followed an unseen stare, the cage, the curled-up pups, the sleepless night at the clinic, the quiet weight of her head on his lap, and how Luna never asked for anything, but gave trust only when it was real. At the end he wrote, "I didn't save them, I just didn't look away." He hit publish and closed the laptop. No expectations. It was simply something he had to say, a way to remember. But by that afternoon, his inbox overflowed. Notifications, messages, emails, comments. "I lost my dog 3 months ago. Your story made me cry for the first time. My daughter struggles with abandonment. I read her Luna's story. She asked, 'Do you think I can learn to trust people again? Like Luna?' I've never owned a dog. But now I understand why some people would give everything for a creature that can't speak. Thank you for giving me hope." Elliot read every message, first in surprise, then in silence. Not because of the praise, but because of what people carried with them, the losses, the wounds they'd never spoken aloud, the quiet shadows no one had dared to enter. A man from Iceland sent a charcoal sketch of Luna, her form encircled by moonlight. A boy from the Philippines wrote by hand, "I was left behind too. But I think I'll be like Luna. I'll find a family." A veterinarian in Argentina asked for permission to print the story and hang it in the waiting room, for those waiting on news that might change their lives. Elliot reopened the article, stared at the photo again. Luna, still nameless back then, sitting in front of the abandoned shack. Her eyes, not accusing, not afraid, just present in a way that couldn't be ignored. He turned to look at her. She was still lying there, one leg curled in, her head resting on a pillow. Unaware that she, a soul once cast aside, had helped thousands around the world step out of their own private darkness. Not with a lecture, not with some grand act, but with her mere existence, honest, unfiltered, a being once abandoned who never backed away from the light. Elliot still woke before dawn. Not from habit, but because he hadn't slept a full night since Emily died. The old flat in London used to echo with footsteps whenever he turned over. The empty half of the bed, where Emily once read books, became a space nothing could fill. Elliot had once thought he'd travel the world with his camera, trying to forget what he couldn't hold on to. But the more he wandered, the more hollow he felt. The pictures were beautiful, the landscapes perfect, but there was no one to share them with, no one to hear the silence behind the lens. And then Luna stepped into his life, not through a call, not through a friendly gesture, but through a gaze he had never seen before. Quiet, unwavering, as if saying, "If you follow, you'll find something." And now, in a small house on the edge of Serafina's woods, Elliot was beginning to understand what he had truly found. Not just a dog he'd rescued, but a part of himself. The part that could still trust, still open up, still choose to stay. There were nights when Elliot sat on the back steps, his eyes resting on the low grass of the garden. Luna lay behind him, ears twitching at his slightest movement. The 3 pups now tumbled across the yard, chasing sticks, barking at shadows, competing over rays of sunlight. And in the rhythm of breath, in the whisper of leaves, Elliot felt his chest grow lighter. He no longer photographed things to keep what couldn't be kept. He captured what was here, what was happening. Like the photo of Luna lying in the sun, eyes half closed, head tilted slightly, a moment of stillness that sang without sound. One afternoon, when the first of the pups climbed onto Elliot's lap and fell asleep, Luna didn't growl. She didn't tense. She simply looked, then closed her eyes. For the first time, Elliot felt accepted. Not as a guest, but as part of the pack. That kind of trust didn't come from pity. It came from something else, a process no one could rush. A space where each wound was seen, but never denied. She had spent sleepless nights. So had he. She had feared footsteps. He had feared silence. But now, when a hand rested gently on her neck without startling her, and a pup dared to fall asleep on his chest, Elliot realized healing is real, and the strange thing is, it didn't begin with strength. It began with a fragile gaze in the forest, with a step taken in uncertainty, with one choice, not to turn away. He hadn't just saved them. They were saving him with every glance, every breath, every quiet moment of peace in the night. They were a family. No papers, no shared blood, just presence and the willingness to breathe together. The sun had not yet risen. A thin veil of mist, like strands of white silk, clung to the trees, sketching faint outlines at the edge of the forest. Elliot sat alone at an old wooden table by the half-open window. A dark cup of tea, long gone cold, rested beside his laptop, its screen casting a soft glow in the dim morning light. He was writing, not to tell a grand story, not to speak on behalf of anyone, but to remind himself of what had happened, and what was still happening. The file name was simple. No one left behind. The first line appeared slowly, as if measured by breath. We are not perfect, but we are not alone. Elliot paused, looked out toward the porch, where Luna lay curled between two sleeping pups. One had a paw slung over her neck, another nestled into the warmth of her belly, and the smallest, the most mischievous, rested its head on her tail like an endless living pillow. In that stillness, Elliot remembered the first day. Those eyes, that uneven gait, her mud-matted fur. And now, a creature once afraid of the light had become the quiet center of a small, peaceful world. He wrote again, "Some wounds cannot be erased, but we can live with them, fully, if we choose to live together. Luna never came because I called. She came when she was ready. And so did I. I truly came home, only when I stopped trying to run from the past I carried." His fingers moved slowly, but they did not stop. Each sentence surfaced like new skin growing over old scars. He did not try to explain. He did not try to advise. He simply shared that sometimes the only thing we can do is not walk away. I used to think I was the one saving them. But the truth is they gave me a reason to stay. A family not born of blood but of patience and quiet waiting. A gentle breeze stirred the room, nudging a pinned photograph that fluttered on the wooden wall. Luna, captured in a sunlit field, eyes closed, chin lifted toward the light. No fear, no armor, just complete presence. He wrote the final line for that morning. I don't know where I'll go next, but I know I won't be going alone. And I believe, for anyone who's ever felt left behind, there is a place and a soul somewhere out there, waiting to walk with you. He pressed save. A small sound echoed, barely audible, but inside Elliot it felt like the full stop to one chapter, and the quiet beginning of something warmer, truer. Elliot didn't think a piece written at dawn would go very far. But that afternoon, a message appeared in his inbox from someone named Isabel Duarte. Just a few lines, written in simple English. I coordinate the Serafina Community Program. We read your story, and we believe it's something people need to hear. Attached was a flyer, an invitation to an open sharing session held monthly at the village's old stone library, where locals gathered to speak of the moments that helped them keep believing in kindness. Elliot sat in silence before the screen. Sharing his story in front of strangers had never come easy. especially not when the story wasn't just about Luna, but about parts of himself he'd once tried to bury. That night, as the pups slept soundly and Luna curled beside the fireplace, Elliot stood before a mirror, invitation card in hand, printed on textured paper. The bold text at the top caught him off guard. Every creature walks a path, and sometimes we need to hear each other's stories to not lose our own way. He looked into his reflection. Not to find courage, but to acknowledge this. Some things only begin once they are spoken aloud. The following Saturday, Elliot stepped into the gray stone room at the village library. Wooden chairs formed a half circle. About 30 people had already taken their seats. No one looked the same. An elderly man with a cane, a few students clutching sketchbooks, a French couple traveling through town, and several others with small dogs nestled quietly in their laps. Luna didn't come. Elliot felt this first telling was something he needed to face alone. When he stepped onto the small wooden platform, the room fell completely still. No cameras, no spotlights, just soft daylight slanting through old window panes and faces that listened with their eyes. Elliot began with the simplest truth: that he came to Serafina just to take photographs, that he wasn't looking for anything, just trying to fill a quiet ache, and that everything changed because of one gaze. She didn't run to me. She didn't bark. She just looked. And with that look, I followed. He recounted the journey through the forest, the abandoned cabin, the sleepless night at the vet, the trembling hands wrapping tiny lives in a worn jacket, and the moment when a once abandoned dog rested her head on his lap, as if to say, "I choose to trust you again." Every time Elliot paused, the room seemed to pause with him. Some wiped their eyes. Some reached for the hand beside them. And others, even those who had just met him, nodded gently, as if something deep and old had just been understood. "I'm not a hero," Elliot said quietly. "I was just in the right place, at the right time, to not walk away." The room fell silent again, but this time with warmth. Someone asked from the crowd, "And how is Luna now?" Elliot smiled, a gentle smile, small, but enough to soften every heart present. "She's teaching me how to stay," he replied. "Not out of duty, but out of love." Night descended slowly over Serafina, as if even time itself was reluctant to leave this place. The breeze carried the cool scent of mint from the hedgerow, while insects sang their ancient lullaby beneath the sky's deepening blue. The little house Elliot had chosen to stay in was no longer a shelter. It was home, with the sound of footsteps, the rhythm of breaths, and the warm silences shared between beings once forgotten. In the garden, Luna was running, not the frantic run of an escape, but the joyful sprint of someone who had finally been given permission to feel free. Her once matted coat now shimmered under the moonlight, like flowing black silk. Behind her, 3 puppies clumsily gave chase, tumbling through the grass with boundless, reckless joy. One of them tripped over its own paws, trying to catch a sibling's tail. Luna turned, trotted back, gently nudged the pup at the neck, and waited as it scrambled up again. No bark, no sign of impatience, only patience, only a kind of love that needed no translation. From the doorway, Elliot watched. The camera that once never left his side now sat idle on the windowsill day after day. But tonight, his hands instinctively reached for it, not to capture sorrow, but to preserve something that had come back to life. He adjusted the focus. No need to zoom, no need to calculate exposure, no thought of composition, just a quiet breath, and a viewfinder full of something unrepeatable. Luna stood at the center of the yard, head held high. The moonlight bathed her face, and for the first time, her eyes no longer carried suspicion. Instead, they held something close to peace. One of the puppies had wandered close, now sitting by Elliot's foot. It looked up at him, tongue out, eyes glistening in the glow from the kitchen. Elliot chuckled softly. "All right," he whispered. "Everyone ready?" Click. The shutter broke the stillness, not to interrupt, but to join the symphony already playing beneath the stars. He looked at the image. There was nothing spectacular, no striking angle, no dramatic background, but it was the first photo he had taken in a long, long time. That did not carry sorrow. A photo not to remember what had been lost, but to honor what had finally been found. Later, he placed it in a simple wooden frame and hung it in the center of the living room wall. No caption, no date, just one picture, and the ones who now belonged beneath a shared moon. Beneath the frame, Elliot wrote a single sentence in his everyday handwriting. "No one left behind." The story of Luna was never just about rescuing a dog and her pups. It was, quietly but powerfully, a reminder of something all of us search for: a place to belong. A gaze that doesn't judge, only trusts. The German Shepherd, so often praised for strength, loyalty, and intelligence, had become, in Luna, something else entirely: a symbol of resilience, of silent souls that have been hurt, but never stop hoping. From a quiet glance in a deep forest, from a trembling but determined step, from the fragile breath of 3 newborn lives. This story reached into the hearts of those who heard it, reminding us that the connection between humans and animals does not need words, only presence. And if there is one truth that remains after all of this, it is this: no one left behind, no one forgotten, and sometimes the light we are searching for comes from the eyes that first found us in the dark.